So thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. And between Secretary Crowfoot's great introduction and Deborah's, I have nothing more to add. That's pretty much it. But I prepared it, so you're going to hear it. So, but thank you, Deborah, and thank you, everybody. Good morning. And there are a lot of people who I know and who know me, but in case you don't, my name is Becky Yoda. I am the Habitat Conservation Program Manager, bear with me, with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Marine Region. The responsibility of the management within the department falls under my program. So today I'm going to give you a very brief reminder of how the MPAs were created, and then an overview of our current management program. So those of you who know what I'm talking about, just nod your head in agreement. So there we go. That was the introduction slide. So as Deborah said, many of you know, the MPA, the Marine Life Protection Act. See, you got me fuddled. Was passed in 1999. It applied to all state waters, including offshore islands, and it required the redesignation and improvement, really, of the existing marine protected areas at the time. That was guided by 6 goals that were encompassed into the Act. Roughly summarized, included the protection of biodiversity and the structure, function, and integrity of ecosystems, the conservation and protection of marine life populations, the improvement of recreational, educational, and study opportunities within the MPAs while protecting the biodiversity, protection of marine heritage and unique habitats. They needed to have clear objectives, effective management and enforcement, and based on sound science, and designed and managed to function as a network. MLPA also called for the creation of a master plan and a management program that included the goals and other provisions to help meet the goals, like monitoring, research, and evaluation, enforcement, outreach and education, and adaptive management, meaning even if we mess up, we learn and we evolve as we go forward, and management can change. Or even if we get it right, we can change. So a significant effort went into establishing the MPA network, supported by a public-private partnership that this slide shows just at a glance. So the MPA proposal development was done by a regional stakeholder group with guidance and evaluation from a science advisory team, a policy team, which was appointed by the Secretary at the time, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Once those proposals were solidified, then they were submitted to the Fish and Game Commission for a decision on whether adopt them or not adopt them, and to go forward with providing regulatory support for those MPAs. As a result, as you've already heard, in 2012, California's MPA network, stretching from the Oregon border to the Mexico border, was completed, and establishing, as you've already heard, the largest science-based, stakeholder-driven network of MPAs in North America, which is recognized globally and serves as a model for MPAs around the world. And you'll hear more about that international effort later in the morning. But we also had a chance, many of us in this room, to meet with a contingency of Indonesian scientists in February, I believe, who are setting up additional MPAs in their country, and they were very, very interested to learn more about how California put our MPA network together, how we did that, how we are managing it, and the science behind it. So it was a great opportunity, and it just shows how much our MPAs are known around the world. The network includes 124 MPAs and 14 special closures that encompass about 16% of the coast waters, state waters, including islands, and 9% of that in no-take MPAs, which are the backbone of the network. Prior to the MLPA process, there was less than 3% of state waters in MPAs and less than 1% of that in protected areas. Hold on, I have to turn the page. The MLPA is a pioneering piece of legislation because it represents ecosystem-based approach to conserving coastal and ocean biodiversity, as we've already heard and we know is critically important. So instead of focusing management effort on a single species, location, or habitat, entire ecosystems and the interconnection between marine life and habitats are protected. But what about management? Through the MPA management program, the state is committed to ensuring the long-term success of the MPA network through agency coordination and partnerships. The MLPA and the complementary Marine Managed Areas Improvement Act, which we don't talk a lot about, but it was critically important, identified the California Fish and Game Commission as the decision-making authority for the MPAs, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife as the lead managing agency, and the Ocean Protection Council is lead on policy, which was done by separate legislation. But OPC also supports agencies in meeting their mandates and working with partners to develop and implement policies as the need arises. However, management of California MPA's network is a statewide effort, relying on successful coordination between multiple state agencies, tribal representatives, nonprofit organizations, scientists, fishermen, and other stakeholders. Many of these entities are represented, you see on this slide, this logo soup, through the state's MPA statewide leadership team, which is an advisory body consisting of entities that have significant authority, mandates, or interests that relate to the MPA network. OPC convenes the MPA statewide leadership team to improve the coordination, communication, and collaboration among all partners. And the leadership team works together. We've provided a roadmap, and there's a work plan that we can use as we move forward. The MPA management program, guided by a master plan and an outreach guide and a partners plan, and recently a statewide monitoring action plan approved by Ocean Protection Council and the Fish and Game Commission in October, is composed of these four focal areas: outreach and education, research and monitoring, enforcement and compliance, and policy and permitting. Now, by now, all of these things should sound very familiar to you. These focal areas are a direct reflection of the MLPA goals and provisions and recognized by the leadership team and partners as critical components of MPA management, not only just here in California, but also globally. These are really key components of a successful management of any MPA system, whether it's a network or not. Guided by these focal areas, the state works to implement, evaluate, and constantly improve management efforts in MPAs. There has been a significant amount of financial support for the network as well. Funding for the planning and designation of the MPA network was provided through a public-private partnership. The state invested over $18 million in the planning and designation process, matched by over $19 million from private funding. Currently, Ocean Protection Council has a budget of approximately $8 million annually to fund projects and advance the MPA management program. Currently, right now, $5.4 million of that is from the Once Through Cooling policy funding and $2.5 million from general funds. In addition, OPC has invested $19 million for MPAs to date from Prop 84 money. The Department of Fish and Wildlife receives up to $4.5 million annually and has invested over $50 million to date. Our philanthropic partners, of some who are in the room, also invested millions of dollars to private funding for work that serves as foundation to the management plan, especially in outreach and education. And today, the Ocean Protection Council will consider approving $17 million to support MPA monitoring, outreach, and compliance projects. In summary, and what's next? So the network of 124 MPAs was established to safeguard marine life and habitats and generate ecological, cultural, social, and economic benefits now and into the future. Partnerships are critical to the management of the MPAs, and continued financial support from OPC and other partners moving forward is paramount to the success of meeting the goals of the MPA and managing this amazing network that we have. And as Deborah has already said, we're going to have more on a couple of the focal points today on the science. There's outreach and education, and some of the partners are going to provide some of their efforts that they have done today. And at that, Jen, I think, is going to introduce you to the other speakers.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jen Eckerly. I'm the Deputy Director at the Ocean Protection Council, and I also want to just say thank you to everyone for being here today. It's really great to have a packed room. Thanks. So we have two scientists here today. whose work is going to help inform our ongoing MPA management. And I'm going to introduce them now. The first speaker is Dr. Pete Ramundi. And Pete is a professor of ecology and the director of the Institute of Marine Science at UC Santa Cruz. He's a principal investigator with the Partnership for Interdisciplinary Studies of Coastal Oceans, otherwise known as PISCO, and the multi-agency Rocky Intertidal Network, otherwise known as Marine. He was involved in the baseline assessment of California's MPAs and is now focused on long-term monitoring. Today, he's going to be speaking about MPA monitoring in rocky intertidal habitats. So please welcome Dr. Pete Ramundi.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. And before I start talking about MPAs and rocky intertidal, I want to call out two people. One is Becky, who you just talked about, and the other is Liz Whiteman over here. They were both instrumental from the beginning. And I remember meeting with Liz years ago in Half Moon Bay when this was just a pipe dream, and today's the reality of it. And so both of them deserve a lot of congratulations. I'm going to talk to you about MPAs and rocky intertidal habitats, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just wander through the state, show you some pictures of places that we've been, that we're going to go to again and again and again, and also some species, and try to talk to you about intertidal habitats and the species that live there, and then talk to you about how MPAs might be profoundly important in conserving these intertidal habitats. So these are just, and you might look in the back, actually, the pictures are really good in the back, but these are just some pictures of rocky intertidal habitats. This is Harmony Headlands, which is near Cambria, a really isolated spot. It's a granitic reef, it's full of great species, it's isolated, it's hard to get to, and that's one of the characteristics of a lot of these intertidal habitats. Then this is La Jolla. This is a boulder field, really diverse because it's a boulder field and things move around a lot. Lots of people there, but still really diverse. This is an unnamed. There's a lot of places, especially in the north and the north central coast, that we just have no names. We've got GPS coordinates for them, and we go there and we sample, and they're wonderful spots. And this is an unnamed spot up near Guala, actually. And then just some species. So the species, I think, are really important because, as you'll see later, I'm going to talk about how important these intertidal habitats are for science and education, outreach, and public access. One of the things to remember about sandy beaches and rocky intertidal habitats in particular is that this is where most of the public and most of the kids actually interface with the ocean. Very few people have boats and very few people can get underwater, at least until they're older, and so you'll see these habitats are just full of people and educational groups, and it's very important because kids are the gateway to their parents who vote. And so one of the things that's very important about this is this connection between the public and the marine environment. And this is really profoundly important in the change in the culture that has occurred in California and the change in the culture that's occurring throughout actually the world. So this is a blood star, and then an anemone, and then this is a mussel, unfortunately, that ended up in an anemone, is in the process of being digested. And these are just some characteristic, charismatic species that kids love. There's a nudibranch up on the upper left, some sea stars before sea star wasting in the upper right. These are sea palms over here, a beautiful species, mostly northern. They're harvested sometimes, but they're just beautiful, and they're really rare in this state until you get up to the very north coast. And then some weird species, and weird to us, but to invertebrate biologists, we just love them. There's a gooseneck barnacle, which is a harvested species, and then chitons. And these are the things that draw kids in because they're so different from everything else that you see in the world is these species, and they just draw people to them, especially kids. This is just an example. As I said, these areas are magnets for the public. There's two reasons for it. One is they're generally, in California at least, there's roads all over the place and you can get to them, and so you can interact with nature. The other thing that's really important is that they're so diverse compared to almost all this is true for all marine environments. They're so diverse compared to other environments that you can see so many species in such a few number of steps, or fin kicks, as Jen's going to tell you in just a little while, that you can see these things, you can see nature, in a very different way than walking through and maybe listening for birds or going to see things. It's just so compressed and so wonderful in that sense. So these are incredible habitats, and they're incredible, and because they're so incredible, there's a lot of potential impact because there's so many people going. And this is this profound trade-off that we're thinking about all the time, which is we want to encourage visitation because it gets people interested in the marine environment and marine environmental policy. But at the same time, we know that lots of visitation without some sort of guidance and potentially protection can cause problems. This is this trade-off that we're working about all the time on the policy front. On top of this, we have this, which are environmental threats. So we just went through, Jen and I were working on this, these oil spills. This is Refugio Oil Spill. We've had Refugio, there's been a number of them around San Francisco Bay. They can be caused by a pipe blowout, they can be caused by an offshore blowout, they can be caused by a ship running into the bridge in San Francisco. They can be caused from lots of reasons. We've got discharges still, you wouldn't think so, but there's discharges all over California into the intertidal habitats. In Southern California alone, we've been studying the areas of special biological significance, discharges all over the place. We're trying to figure out whether they are causing any impact to these systems. We've got marine diseases, sea star wasting up there. Profoundly important. Jen will talk more about this. Down there, black abalone, withering foot syndrome, caused by another disease. In that case, the bacteria in the uppercase, probably a viral particle. And on top of all of these things, we've got this problem potentially with global change, which I'll talk to you about in a second, which may trump all these other impacts. These areas, rocky intertidal areas, this is it. Here, you can't even see it. There's a little blue sliver there, which is how rare these habitats are compared to all other ones. We've got deep rocky reef. This is the area in the state waters. Shallow rock and kelp forest, sandy beach, and rocky intertidal. And the reason why these sandy beaches and rocky intertidal habitats are so rare is because they exist in a ribbon along the coastline. They're long, but they're real narrow. And so there isn't much of them. So we decided, and then the other thing is that one of the things that this has contributed to is this idea that there needs to be two things that happen to conserve. One is there needs to be regulatory protection, marine protected areas. And the other is, and this is very cool, this is kind of a grassroots thing, is this, which is tide pool etiquette. There are signs all over the state about tide pool etiquette, which is what are the things that you can and should not do when you come visit this, to leave no harm, basically. And these have been manifest across the state. So this is a map of what Becky was talking about, which is our network of survey areas under this agency, or this entity, which is called the Multi-Agency Rocky Intertidal Network. It's existed since 1992. I got started in 1992 with this program. We have over 200 areas that we sample from Alaska down into Mexico and into Gulf of California. About 160 of them are in California itself. They are part of a consortium. This is part of a consortium including the state through the MPA and other things. The state parks, the Coastal Commission has contributed to this. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, formerly MMS, has contributed to this. And together they realize that because of the impacts, the threats, and the visitation and usage, there needs to be a backbone of sampling so we can understand how to manage these things and how to go forward with the conservation of these areas. And what I want to talk about now is I want to talk about results to date relating to rocky intertidal areas that relate to MPA protection. So the first thing I want to point out is that we have been studying since 1992, and unfortunately what we are seeing is a movement of communities to the north. You can think of this kind of, and Jen will talk about this also, as the tropicalization of these communities by biological communities. We said if a site was in San Diego in 1992, in 2002, that same composition of species would have moved 40 kilometers north. And that's because we've had change in the environmental conditions. And so these communities are marching north at about 4 kilometers per year. And what this causes is a change in what I'm going to talk to you about, which is this word resilience. And resilience is a term that means the ability to withstand some sort of force. It could be temperature, it could be wave, it could be anything. But a resilient community is a community that can withstand or recover from a force. And we're all interested in resiliency because that means that you have stability in the ecosystem. And we're looking at attributes that may confer resiliency. And one of those attributes might be level of protection. And level of protection has a particular way that it might cause there to be resiliency. And that's through enhancement of diversity, because there's this widespread understanding that high diversity systems tend to be more resilient than lower diversity systems. So one of the first things we've looked at, and I'm concentrating now in the Central California region, because most of the rocky intertidal habitats that have been protected for the longest period of time are in Central California. Because as Becky alluded to, we've rolled out these regions over time. So the central coast of the mainland was the first group of marine protected areas that were implemented. There were other ones that were out on the Channel Islands that Jen will talk about later on that were even earlier. So there's also results from there. But in the central coast, what you can see is the diversity in green, this is the MPA areas, versus those areas with no protection that we've been sampling, is vastly greater in marine protected areas. So that's the first step. There's more diversity. This is biodiversity in marine protected areas. The second is resiliency. Now, I'm going to take a little while to walk through this graph. This is the most complicated graph we've got here. So the first thing we've got is this is an area, this is pre-MPA designation. This was when there was no protection. So this is an MPA 2B, but it wasn't yet. And this is unprotected at the time. And so you can see this is resiliency here, and these two bars are basically the same. And more resilient means up, and less resilient means down on this graph. This is after, post-designation, after there was protection. So here's green again. These are now MPAs. These were MPAs to be, now they're actual MPAs, and these are still the unprotected areas. And what you can see is resiliency increased during this period of time. This is post-2007. This was a period of really big environmental forcing. Lots of big temperature changes. There was hypoxia in some areas. And so this is a very disturbed area time frame environmentally. And yet, in the MPAs, resiliency shot up. And in unprotected areas, it went down, as you would expect for that time frame. Really good evidence that MPAs may confer resiliency. The last thing I want to tell you about is just a story that is kind of like serendipity, like a lot of ecological stuff is. And this is a case study about fisheries management with red abalone, which is very topical. Mark Kakar and I, who I came here with, just came from a conference in Santa Rosa yesterday, looking at the MPA fisheries and the problems with the MPA, with the red abalone fisheries in the North Coast. And this is primarily based on the subtitle, but I'm going to talk to you about the potential for intertidal contribution to this. The area I'm talking about is near Point Arena, and there's two MPAs there, Arena Rock and Sea Lion Rocks, and there's a little inholding in there called Stornetta Ranch. So that's the key thing, Stornetta Ranch. We're going to talk about this. So, this is a graph that comes from Reef Check. Reef Check does a lot of work up there, and this is the subtitle. And first down here, this is the temperature profile from 2007 to 2018. You can see it's bouncing along, and then about 2013, it starts cranking up, and then 14, 15, 16, it's really hot. So the key thing is it got really hot for two reasons. We had the warm bob, and then we had El Nino effect. Up here, I'm going to first follow this, which is kelp. This is the bull kelp. And this is just how much bull kelp there is. So you can see it's bouncing around, and just about the time it starts getting warm, it crashes. And it's crashing, and it's crashing, and it's crashing. And to the point where there was virtually no bull kelp left in the whole North Coast. This entire kelp forest that extends from Marin up to the Oregon border was basically gone. Now, what was happening? So we have this warm water. Warm water is just bad for kelp just to begin with. But the other thing that happens is that there are these other species. These are purple urchins. And so purple urchins, sea urchins, which are voracious herbivores, they're going along at very low densities. And this is probably due to two things. There weren't very many of them, maybe. But mostly it's because purple urchins tend to hunker down until they get really hungry. And then they go rogue. And they come out and they start eating everything in sight. And so they're down here, they're hiding out, and as the kelp drops, they go rogue, and they come out, and they also start reproducing. And the populations build, and they take out the rest of the kelp. So not only is there no kelp, I mean, all the drift is gone, the bottoms are barrens, there's coral and algae all over the place. It looks like pavement, red pavement, but it looks like pavement. And then what happens is the red abalone, which depend upon drift for food, they start crashing or moving. Probably a little bit of both, but they're dying, lots of shells, and they start moving inshore, inshore. Right here in the X is where the fisheries got officially closed. So there was no more sport take after that period of time. They're still falling. I just got those last year data I got from Jan Freiwald about a week ago, and they've actually gone down in 2018 again, and they'll be sampling, and the suspicion is they've gone down even further. So there's been an utter collapse of the red abalone populations on the North Coast. You got to keep this red line in mind. Okay, this is a red line. Keep that in your mind. So now we're going to go to Stornetta Ranch. This is an onshore ranch. It's in this. It was in an area right near Point Arena. And it's a cool story. This is the Stornetta brothers, and they were ranchers, basically. They had dairy cows, and they were bachelor brothers, and they had no heirs, and they bequeathed their land to the state, who then had it be administered by BLM. And so it was completely private access with no way into it until 2004. Oops. Until 2004. It was open to harvest in 2004 and 2005. So all of these virgin abalone stocks were opened up. It was closed in 2010 as part of the MLPA, as a state MPA. And as you'll see here, what we see is this dynamic, which is both really interesting because you can show the importance of MPAs in a number of ways, but also how quickly things can happen. So this is the private period. So this is private property. These are abalone numbers in our plots there. It doesn't matter what the numbers are. Just see what this line is. If it's about this high, as soon as it opened up, the stocks crashed. And that's because of tape. The other thing to remember about this is this word here. This is the legal size. So I'm following the legal size, which is important in some ways because they're legal size. But the other thing that's really important about this is legal size means they're really reproductive. They have lots of capacity to reproduce because they're big. And so the stock crashes in terms of numbers, but also even more so with respect to reproduction. So it crashes, it goes down. In 2010, the last year of legal take, there were virtually no legal-sized animals there anymore. Protection was implemented. You can see the recovery here. It climbs, it climbs, it climbs. It gets up to this population here, which is just what it was in its historic period. It was at equilibrial high density. Lots of babies. So lots of potential to reproduce. Now I'm going to superimpose that red line that I told you to remember on here. And this is the subtidal population in exactly the same area. And you can see what's going on here. This is going along. And then it comes out of this population and it crashes. So there's no more adults there. There's no more abalone, if any. There's no more capacity in the subtidal to reproduce because there's no animals there to reproduce. So how do these populations potentially get replaced? They potentially get replaced by the guys in green, which are just inshore. So there may be coupling. The important take-home message is not about intertidal or subtidal or deep rocky reef or sandy beach. The important message here is that these habitats are coupled. And this coupling between two areas, one that are protected, can cause there to be greater resilience potentially in the population than if you just look at habitat by habitat attributes. And the reason for this is that we retain reproductive capacity in the general area that can repopulate areas that might be hit in other realms. The last thing is just a summary of the points I just made, which are intertidal habits. They're rare, they're beautiful in almost every way. They're highly diverse, they're heavily used. They're important for education and outreach. They're under distinct threat from global to localized ways. MPAs in intertidal habitats have higher biodiversity than unprotected areas. They're more resilient than unprotected areas. They have shown rapid enhancement of harvested populations due to protection. Abalone is recovered within 7 years. They may contribute to the recovery of species in other habitats. As an example, the abalone and subtidal rocky reefs. I'm done. And now it's
Thank you, Dr. Raimondi. Before I introduce Jen, I noticed there's some people in the hallway. Maybe if you guys want to come on in so you can hear what's going on. Yeah, sure. Okay, so it's my pleasure to now introduce Dr. Jen Cassell, who is a research professor at the Marine Science Institute at UC Santa Barbara. She's a marine ecologist specializing in nearshore ecosystems, including kelp forests, and also works on coral reefs. She's been involved with MPA design and monitoring for California and globally for over 20 years. Today, she will speak about lessons learned from MPAs in the Channel Islands. Please welcome Dr. Jen Cassell.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. So whereas Pete focused in on a single habitat, I'm going to focus in on a specific geography, the Channel Islands, which is just in my backyard, and a really, really interesting place. And we've been working there for a long time, and I have a few lessons to tell you about the MPAs. So this is a map of the 4 northern Channel Islands, and the marine protected areas are shown here in the red and the blue. And it's interesting because, as Pete indicated, these were actually the first set of MPAs that went in the state. They were implemented in 2003 prior to the big push on the MLPA network. And the other really interesting thing about the Channel Islands is because of their location and where they sit in California. If you look at this inset map, or just picture the state of California, the Channel Islands sit at that point where the coastline turns roughly from north-south to east-west, and that point is called Point Conception. And it marks what we call a biogeographic transition region. It's a place where the cold waters mix with the warmer waters. Cold waters from the north, warmer waters from the south. And you can see that in this sea surface temperature map with those 4 Channel Islands, where honestly, in a distance of only 60 miles from the easternmost to the westernmost island, we can experience temperature differences of 6 to 7 degrees. That's almost the temperature difference you can see sometimes from deep in Southern California all the way to Northern California. So really, really interesting place, biologists' dream in a way. And what this means is that it's a place with a lot of interesting biodiversity. If you were to put your head in the water in the eastern part of the channel, you would see species that have tropical affinities like this. It's actually our state fish, the Garibaldi, tropical family. Or these California sheephead, these female, I don't know what they're doing here. 2 females. But if you were to poke your head underwater, say in a kelp forest in the west, like at San Miguel Island, you might see species that have cold water affinities, like these juvenile rockfishes. The islands are also home to a huge diversity of marine mammals, whales, dolphins, seabirds, even sharks. And so they are somewhat of an economic driver for our region in terms of tourism. We also lately have been seeing species come back from the brink, literally, of extinction. This guy, this handsome fella, is the king of the kelp forest, the giant sea bass. See those around quite a bit. And even the red abalone that Pete was just talking about, which was really decimated in the Channel Islands region due to disease and also overfishing. And speaking of fishing, the area is really important for a number of different fisheries. And here's an interesting fact, that when the red sea urchin fishery started in California about 40 years ago, since that time, almost 50% of the cumulative landings of red sea urchin have come out of the Santa Barbara Channel and Channel Islands region. And our fishermen are very proud because California's gold, apparently the urchins that do come out of this region are really, really prized. But there's lots of other fisheries as well. Finfish are important for both commercial fishers and for sport fishing. Now, supporting all of this incredible biodiversity requires a diversity in habitats as well. So like I said, Pete focused on the Rocky Intertidal. I'm going to focus on the region as a whole. But the area, perhaps because of the density of academic agencies, academic institutions, agencies, NGOs, supports a lot of different monitoring efforts in all of the different habitats. And I'll just run through some of those now. As Pete said, the Rocky Intertidal and the sandy beaches, these are the interfaces between land and sea. Of course, the iconic California giant kelp forest. And then the deeper waters that some of you are probably less familiar with, and they require technology to be able to access high-tech or low-tech, like these drop cameras that we just chuck over the boats and hope we get back again. Remotely operated vehicles and even yellow submarines are required to explore these deeper habitats, but there's a lot of biodiversity that's also really important in the region. And finally, I don't want to imply that all of the monitoring that's done is done by academic or agency scientists. A lot of the work we do involves stakeholders and collaborators, like this fisherman who's conducting surveys in and out of the MPAs for a fish tagging project that we have. Now, as I said, the Channel Islands was one of the first sets of MPAs in the network. And so it's been the subject of a lot of the evaluations that have been done to date. And so I just want to tell you, this is a brochure. This will actually be, I brought a whole bunch of copies. They'll be downstairs on the tables. So I'm going to do this really quickly. But what we've learned to date is this, that when you close these areas to fishing, if you look at the top plot here, over time, what we see is an increase in the biomass, and that just means the total weight of fish species that are targets of fisheries. That's the green line here on the top plot. But importantly, if you look at the biomass of fish species that are fished outside the reserves, we do not see massive declines. The difference between these two lines, the blue one and the green one in the top plot, are the effects of conservation. Now, the reason that this is important, that this blue line is not going straight down, is that was a pretty big concern for a lot of the fishing communities, that when marine protected areas would go into place, that would compact all the remaining fishermen on the outside, and that the resources would tank it. And we don't see that. We compare these trends to the patterns in the non-targeted or non-fish species because we don't expect the same patterns for species that aren't fished, and that's what we see. We don't see the same trends. The other thing that I think is really interesting that we've learned from the previous studies is that if you think of the Channel Islands as kind of a microcosm of the state, we've learned that the responses across the different MPAs are not the same. And in fact, in our case, we saw greater responses in the eastern part of the channel where there's more fishing than the west. But what I think this does for us is it sets the scene for what we might expect as we start looking across the state, which is a much larger geographic area. We don't expect all MPAs to act exactly the same across such a diverse state. So that's what we've learned. But as Pete implied, and I'll tell you more about, right now, our coastal waters in California are facing a whole litany of stressors. And we're starting to ask other questions of our MPAs. We're starting to ask more about our MPAs, and we're starting to ask more of our MPAs. And so beyond building up the biomass of species that tend to be fished when they're not fished, what else do MPAs, what are they likely to do for us? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you 3 very short stories today, all disasters. I'm normally not a disaster monger, but I think there's some really interesting lessons to be learned in what we have done in the Channel Islands. And my stories are of invasion, marine heat waves, and disease. Oh my. The first story is a story of invasion. So Southern California has definitely seen its fair share of marine invasions over time, and one of the most recent invasions is of this algae, Sargassum horneri. It comes from Asia. It didn't even really have a common name, so Southern California folks are calling it the devilweed. It was, interestingly enough, introduced into the Long Beach harbor in 2003, and so we know exactly where it was first found. And it's been spreading north and south of Long Beach since that time. And what you can see is that this algae tends to just blanket shallow reefs, which are home to our native algae, things like kelp forests and so forth. So causing these mats can really affect the higher trophic levels. And so we, using the long-term monitoring programs, have been tracking the invasion into the Channel Islands, and in particular, we focused on the easternmost island, Anacapa. And the reason for that, besides being a place where there is a lot of long-term monitoring going on from my program, PISCO, and also from the National Park Service, Channel Islands National Park, Kelp Forest Monitoring Program, all of the different monitoring sites are here in the red and the white. But what Anacapa also has is an interesting set of marine protected areas because it has they're different ages and different levels of protection. So let me walk you through this, but here, what we call the old SMR is the north shore of that easternmost island. That no-take reserve was put into place in 1978, okay, so 40 plus years of protection. The rest of the north shore was implemented in 2003 as a no-take reserve and a partial take reserve, and the entire south shore is a fished area. And what we noticed through our long-term monitoring was that invasive algae, it was not invading the same across these zones. So here's the biomass of sargassum in the different zones. You can barely see this, but this is the old no-take reserve. It resisted the invasion. But interestingly enough, so did the fish area. We saw very little sargassum in the fished area as well. Super cool, not necessarily what we expected. And the newish marine protected areas were heavily invaded. So what the heck is going on, right? Okay, I'm going to tell you what's going on, or at least our hypotheses for what's going on using pictures. So, because I like pictures. The picture on the left is from the old no-take reserve. And what you see here, what I see, is a really lush, really dense algal community, giant kelp forest, understory algae. And what we think is going on here is that all of this lush native kelp forest is outcompeting the sargassum for space on the bottom and also for light that it needs to grow. The picture on your left here, although it's a close-up, it shows what a lot of the fished area looks like. And we call this an urchin barren. As Pete pointed out, urchins can, when they get into huge abundance, just take off, cover the bottom, and they are voracious herbivores, and they gobble up everything, including any little invaders like sargassum, including all other algae as well. So competition for space and light in the old MPA and herbivory is keeping the sargassum down. Similar invasional outcomes, but contrasting ecosystem states. And I'll leave it to you to pick which your favorite ecosystem state would be, because I know which one mine would be. Now, what about those new reserves? Well, if I had pictures of them, they'd be somewhere in the middle of these two pictures. Not enough time yet to develop a lush algal community like this, but also not an urchin barren, the recovery of some predators that have restored enough urchins. So somewhere in between, not enough competition, but not enough herbivory. And that game is being played out as we speak. And our long-term monitoring, as we follow this, we will see if those newer MPAs go this way or go this way. Okay, so that's the invasion story. And I think the lesson learned from this story, for me at least, is that the decisions that we make about marine management, including marine protected areas, can actually do something against invasive species. But the story is not going to be that simple. There's complexities that we have to understand with the science. Okay, my second story is about heat waves. Pete implied that things got hot in 2014. You saw this image in the beginning when I told you about the gradient of temperatures, it's sea surface temperature. But what I didn't tell you is that this is an average from 2005 to 2013. This is what we call normal in the Channel Islands. But in 2014, things in California really started to heat up. And what this did in the channel, and as Pete mentioned, it started with an El Nino, and then this atmospheric phenomenon called the blob, or I like calling it the ridiculously resilient ridge, easy to say. And what that did is it trapped hot water against the entire Pacific coast. And what it did in the Channel Islands is two things that made the average temperature way, way, way hotter, but it also broke down that gradient, right, from warm to cold. Kind of made everything sort of heat up. So using our monitoring data in the kelp forest now for the fishes, we wanted to know how this heat wave changed the communities. And what you would expect, right, probably what I would expect is things that like warm water are going to increase and things that like cold water are going to decline. And that's exactly what we saw. And this is work of my graduate student, Ryan Friedman, who's showing that the reefs in the Channel Islands are essentially becoming tropicalized. And I use that in quotes. We aren't actually fully getting real coral reef species up, but the communities, what we did is we took all of the different fish species that live in the Channel Islands, and we classified them into groups that, the ones that like warm water, that would, like me, and the ones that like cold water, like Mark Carr. And then we looked at how they're changing over time. And right here in 2014, right when the heat wave started, you see the density of the warm species taking off and the cold ones declining. But really what we wanted to know was, this is just across all the sites in the Channel Islands, right? Did the MPAs have any effect? Did they mitigate or buffer these community changes? No, they didn't. That's the answer. So what we found was that the warm species increased both inside and outside of the MPAs pretty equally. And those cold species declined, again, both inside and outside pretty equally. So it's only been 4 or 5 years now, only 4 or 5 years of heat wave. So I think the lesson here that I take from this story is that MPAs are not a panacea for every climate stressor that's going to be thrown their way. Now, the heat wave was so dramatic it changed the entire ecosystem across the Channel Islands. So it's not to say that with continued monitoring that MPAs could have some effects on the redistribution of these communities. But that's going to depend, one, it's going to take more tracking, and two, it's going to depend a lot on how the fisheries respond to these changing communities as well. My final story in this litany of disease is about sea star wasting disease and how the protection of entire communities and trophic and food webs within MPAs can provide some resiliency. It's a little bit similar to the story that Pete just told. So what's the deal with sea star wasting? Right around that same time as that heat wave started in 2013-14, disease swept through and caused a massive die-off of sea stars along the entire west coast of North America. And particularly hard hit was this species, the sunflower star, Pycnopodia helianthoides. And this is really important. I mean, this is what happened to them, by the way. They just rot, just swim around and see rotted piles of sea star. But this species, Pycnopodia, the sunflower star, is a pretty voracious predator on the sea urchins, which you've now heard several times, can be damaging to kelp forests when the numbers increase. And as Pete showed you, a version of this story is playing out in the North Coast right now. What he didn't tell you is that the sea stars, the Pycnopodia, up in the North Coast died. He did show you purple urchins increased like crazy, and now kelp has been lost through that whole region, right? And that's because in the North Coast, this was pretty much the major predator, one of the only games in town. But in the Southern California, not the case. There are other suite of predators that eat urchins, like this big, handsome male California sheephead. I apologize for my love of fishes and how I refer to them in endearing terms, but I do love them. But also the California spiny lobster is a pretty good predator on urchins as well. And these species have been known to control urchins. But both of these species are fished. They're both the subject of both commercial and recreational. They're fished quite a lot in the Channel Islands. And so, oops, sorry, let me go back. And so we wanted to see how the heat waves and the loss of the sea star predator affected the kelp forests, in particular the urchin dynamics in the Channel Islands, where there was what we call functional redundancy in the predators, okay? So I'm going to show you in data what happened. This is just to convince you, and I should point out this is work of an undergraduate student in my lab, Jake Esiguar. So this is just to convince you that the sea stars died. We haven't actually seen a sunflower star on our transects in the Channel Islands since 2014. Not one, okay? So they died and they haven't come back. But what about the other two urchin predators? The California sheephead and the California spiny lobster. And what you're looking at is the patterns in time from 2010 to 17 inside the marine protected areas in the red and outside the marine protected areas in the blue. Both of the other predators, sheephead and lobsters, are more abundant inside the protected areas than they are outside the protected areas. And you'll have to take it on faith, but the individual fish and lobster are also a lot bigger in the marine protected areas. So what effect has that had on the urchins? Exactly what you would expect if the protection of these predators is exhibiting control on the urchins. More urchins outside the marine protected areas, here in the blue, and fewer urchins inside the protected areas, in the red. And so we've shown here, and ultimately, I think this is going to happen. I'm not going to show you kelp, but ultimately, if these trends continue, this will have dramatic effects on the giant kelp in the MPAs. So what I think the lesson from this story is that it's the same lesson that Pete just mentioned, which is the protection of an entire food web. It essentially provides insurance to catastrophe. If you think of the loss of the sea star as a catastrophe, and that's not fish, it's going to happen inside and outside the protected areas, then protection of these redundant predators is an insurance to the removal of other species. So that's it. That's my 3 stories and my take-home messages. The work that I showed you and the photos that I showed you come from a lot of different people. This is just a few of the dive team from UC Santa Barbara. This group in particular took a lot of those photos, so I'd like to thank them. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you to Becky and Jen and Pete, and we have about 5 minutes for questions if anyone has questions for any of them. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Jen. Great talk. Thanks. I'm curious, because I know when people are starting to see the sisters are in fact coming back and rebounding. How come that's not occurring in the Channel Islands where you do have these other herbivores controlling those urchins that keep the sea stars? I'm just kind of curious why you aren't seeing the rebound.
Yeah, so the question was, some places in the state and the West Coast are starting to see a rebound in the sunflower star and some of the other stars. Why aren't we seeing it in the Channel Islands? It's a good question. I don't really know why. We're not getting recruitment. We also aren't seeing a rebound in any of the other stars as well. So the other pisasters aren't coming back either. For the Pycnopodia, the sunflower star, admittedly, the Channel Islands is sort of the end of the range for them. They are a cold water species. So it may be that it's harder to recover a species when it's at the far edges of its range because it's not getting recruitment from all over the place. My urchin fisherman friends tell me I'm wrong. They have seen some Pycnopodia out there. We're just not picking them up on farm monitoring.
Can I add to
Yeah, please do.
I think really what you're talking about is probably other stars. There's been a pretty profound rebound in some of the pisasters, not in the Channel Islands, but in the Intertidal. But
Yeah.
Pycnopodia is extraordinarily rare, if present at all, throughout the entire state.
Yeah, I've been talking to my colleagues at Friday Harbor, and that's in Washington, out in the San Juan Islands. They are not finding Pycnopodia right now either.
No.
Yeah.
Other questions? Thank you very much. It was a great way to kick off the morning. So now we're going to hear from a panel of several partners that we work really closely with who are leading unique efforts to help improve MPA management in the state. So I'm going to invite up Mike Stefanik and Calla Allison and Megan Van Pelt and Jennifer Savage, and then I will do more detailed introductions in a minute. I need to separate you two.
No, you got me confined to this chair.
Yeah.
So,
So I'm going to start with an introduction to Mike Stefanik, and then we'll have some questions for you, Mike, and then we'll just move down the line. Does that sound good? Okay.
Yep.
So Mike is an assistant chief at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Law Enforcement Division. The Law Enforcement Division is responsible for enforcement of regulations inside MPAs, among a range of other duties. Enforcement involves patrolling, investigating tips, delivering citations or other enforcement actions. And enforcement and compliance, as everyone in this room knows, is really critical to the long-term success of our MPA network. However, having a network of 124 MPAs spanning over 1,000 miles of coastline can provide a challenge for enforcement. So innovation in this space is really key to make enforcement as streamlined and efficient as possible. So Mike, your first question is, can you tell us a little bit about how technology might change or improve law enforcement to better protect our network of MPAs?
indeed. So obviously there's a tremendous amount of technology that's available, ever more increasingly in speed at which it comes to us. For a significant part of what we do has to do with tracking activities and stuff like that. And we work along with our federal partners as well. There have been significant advances in vessel monitoring, along with which is a federal component, and we're looking at potentially expanding some of that to the commercial fisheries, other commercial fisheries that don't require it. There's also some smaller components to that as well, as that technology continues to improve, as small as a cell phone at this point, mainly regarding data loggers and stuff like that. So there's some potential for further monitoring of the fleet as time goes by. And And then the other thing I wanted to talk to on that is we have a couple of projects that we're looking at with some private entities that work with the Navy and the Coast Guard on monitoring, just general vessel monitoring off the coast of California and off the coast of the United States as well. That's has some potential there. Some of that is probably way outside of our accessibility to it, but there is some potential for growth in that arena, along with our federal partners. And then there's been some work on geofencing, which shows some potential. I've had a couple of conversations with some private companies that work in Australia and New Zealand, and they build basically buoy-mounted geofencing type activity, and probably going to have a conversation with them down the road. But probably the single greatest thing for us as a department, and I'll be real brief on this, is that over the last year we acquired a records management system, which we've had some variation of that over time, and specifically related to that, being brief, that'll give us an opportunity to collect, enforcement contact information, statistical information that's important for us to, potentially use as predictive policing policies and stuff like that. Looking at seasonal location stuff, information that comes in to see if we have an enforcement void somewhere, or if there's an enforcement void, is it because we haven't been there? Or is it just there's no activity there? So there's a lot of work, especially with this records management system, that we look to in the future to help apply better enforcement policies and techniques going forward. So,
Thank you. Great. So creating and working with local partnerships can help with enforcement efforts. Can you talk a little bit about partnerships that you have in the Marine region that can provide benefits to law enforcement?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work in this area too. So historically, we worked with our federal partners at NOAA, the Office of Law Enforcement. We have a JEA contract with them. That's a collaborative effort where we work together with NOAA and identify specific priorities that the federal government has, and then we try to mold that into our into stateside priorities and work on a better picture of enforcement program overall on the coast. We also work with the United States Coast Guard. These are obviously our federal partners. We work along with them on joint enforcement details, stuff like that, and that's all related to MPA. Some of it's related to MPA, not across the board, but both of them are related to MPA. Especially south of San Francisco. We do a little bit of work north of San Francisco out of Crescent City, and I see some expansion there coming forward. So that's been just a federal partnership kind of cooperative thing that we worked with. Probably more important than that is over the last approximately 4 years, we've worked with some NGOs on certain projects. One of them specifically is called the Electronic Fishing Information Network. EFINS is the acronym for it. And that's just a cell phone-based application that was started out as developed by a science group out of UCSB, and then it transferred into a collaborative effort between our partners in the NGO world, along with the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, and to develop this app with a private partner to kind of work the same way briefly as our RMS system does, but maybe a little more user-friendly. And it gives us the opportunity to, in that particular application, and we look kind of for the same thing in RMS down the road, so, but it gives us the opportunity for real-time, at sea, potentially being able to say, look at your phone and identify a particular vessel that was contacted yesterday versus, over data collection takes a long time. So it'll be a little bit more readily available to enforcement units while they're at sea or off the coast of California.
Thank you. Okay, last question for you. You and your wardens have been involved in many enforcement cases throughout the years. Are there any cases that have really influenced the way that law enforcement is conducted in MPAs?
So, just as a general comment, pretty much all of our cases in some way, shape, or form affect how we enforce, generally speaking, but specifically in the MPA world. It has to do with, as they get smarter, we need to get smarter, and we need to adapt to. And I'm not saying there's a bunch of criminals out there doing a certain thing, but if you're looking at the criminal element about it, which is my world, our world, enforcement's world, you do have to. They're always looking at maximizing their opportunity to blur the line. Not all of them, but they want to get as close to that line. We need to adapt to that as well. So, as enforcement continues to mature and evolve and stuff like that, there's pretty much all enforcement contacts or all big cases that we have some application to our manipulating how we do enforcement activity. I'm sure everybody in the room, or most of you, heard about a case called the Pacific Star. That case originated back in 2013, and it took many years to bring that through, the court, and then through the Department and Fish and Game Commission to a resolution, which is only really in the last few months potentially completely dormant at this point. But one of the things that came out of that was some legislative work, and this is some potential down the road as things continue, is that it created a need potentially for some legislative changes to the Fish and Game Code, especially related to violations specifically within MPAs and the CPFV world, which is the cattle boats, commercial passenger fishing vessels, where any one of us would go out, jump on a boat, and go fish any day of the week, pretty much off the coast. So the one thing related to that is that law actually became effective January 1 of this year. And as far as I know, we have one case as of right now, which occurred in March off the Footprint MPA, where we contacted a CPFE that was fishing inside the MPA, and that will test the penalty phase of that new law as we go forward. So it hasn't been adjudicated yet. It'll probably be a little while, but we will start to see some benefits of that. Quick comment on just an overall comment from the fleet. We work with the fleet. We work with the associations that represent the fleet, and the majority of them are well aware and are especially about the Pacific Star case. They're aware of it. They're glad that that the department has paid attention to that. We were successful there, and they know they're going to be held accountable. So we're seeing some positive feedback in that world as well. And then just on a not a funny note, but it's sad. We back in December we had a case in the same thing, Footprint MPA, was where a vessel was contacted fishing right on the line. It was a private vessel. The boarding officers contacted that boat. They didn't warn them. They educated them as to where it was. They had a plotter. Everything looked good. They basically everybody shook hands, went about their business. The patrol boat went off on some other enforcement activity, only to get probably several miles away and see that boat had drifted into the MPA. Launched a skiff, went out there, sure enough, found the boat fishing in the MPA. After they had already educated them and they had a plotter to tell them exactly where they were at. That's not the end of the story. They closed that out with the infraction component, and thinking that would be the end of their day, they went off on a patrol of the Channel Islands, and several miles away for the rest of the day. And while they were returning home, they get a radar hit right smack dab in the center of that MPA, having no premonition that they'd be contacting the same vessel again. That's exactly what happened. Contacted the same vessel, third time, same day. This time it was there were misdemeanor citations issued along with gear seized, and there were some over limits as well. So there's a lot of stuff associated with that. But yeah, it's that case actually adjudicated, so there were some fines involved in that. We're working through some evidence stuff, but I'm getting a little wordy now. So it's
Very bold.
yeah, it's not not everybody violates. Generally speaking, I think we see really good compliance overall. But hopefully with this increased penalties, what we'll see there is the increase in pressure for the commercial and the sport fishermen not to violate as a deterrent. It's not a hammer; it's a deterrent. So
Thank you. Thank you for your partnership and everything that you do to help protect our resources out there.
You bet.
Okay.
Best job in the world.
Our next panelist is Kala Allison, and Kala is the director of the MPA Collaborative Network. The Collaborative Network is comprised of 14 regional collaboratives along the California coast that helps ensure stakeholders have a voice in MPA management and stewardship through a grassroots, localized, and participatory approach. The collaborative provides a forum for nonprofits, tribal representatives, government staff, municipalities, academic institutions, scientists, aquaria, and fishermen to work together to enhance understanding and compliance of MPAs. And Kala created this collaborative network in 2012. Welcome, Kala. Can you tell us a little bit about how grassroots efforts and community involvement benefit MPA management?
Sure. Well, I mean, first, I just want to say, I mean, this is an incredible piece of legislature. It's an incredible process that we went through to have these marine protected areas, and I think we want to make sure that they're not paper parks, of course. We want to manage them for the long term, and part of that effort is making sure that they're part of the culture, that we really start enabling communities to become stewards of their MPAs, and hopefully that spreads beyond the coast and inland, and it becomes a part of who we are, our coastal stewards. So that's what we try to work on at the local level, and we hope that helps with the long-term MPA management by bringing together the people that know these areas the best. And you think about what that means. Those experts, sure, there's the scientists that are out there monitoring these areas, for sure. There's the wardens that are out there enforcing. But it's also the people that are taking their morning walk every day on the beach, and they are seeing changing ocean conditions. It's the lifeguard that shows up to work and does a beach assessment and writes down what the ocean conditions are and checks out the beach and the currents. It's the surfer. It's the fisherman. It's the whale watch businesses. It's the dive shops. You bring all these people together and they start sharing stories about what they're seeing. If they're seeing people taking from certain places, if they're seeing changing species in the intertidal, and sharing that information, and then taking that to the MPA management team, and we start really making it this community effort to manage these marine protected areas long term. And I'll give one kind of brief example. Is we had one collaborative that, we had this sign that said for the no-take state marine reserves, and it had, a fish with a hook and a cross through it. And they said, we're seeing a lot of people that are taking other things. They're not just fishing. They're taking from the intertidal. They're taking lobster. We also need something that shows that you can't collect. And we took that information back to Fish and Wildlife and back to Ocean Protection Council, and developed signage that also has the hand with the sea star that shows you can't collect and you can't fish. And so just kind of that back and forth has really showed the community that if you engage in this stewardship and you participate, you'll be listened to. And also for the managing agencies, it's like, hey, there's some good ideas coming from the local level from these experts, and we should really work together on it. So I think it's a big part of making sure that these MPAs really have a long-term impact.
Great. So you just talked about this a little bit, but we'll dig in a little bit more. So the collaborative network was established right after the completion of the MPA network, and now you represent all of the collaboratives on the statewide leadership team and acting as a bridge between the local efforts on the ground and the advisory body to the Secretary for Natural Resources. And so can you give us another example of how ideas generated by a local collaborative have influenced MPA management?
Sure. I think one that just comes to mind, probably because of what Mike said about the infraction level, is when the regulations first came out, we went to allied agencies that also had site authority and had joint jurisdiction around marine protected areas, and we were saying, just so you know, these are marine protected areas. If you see somebody violating, it would be great if you could help with that enforcement effort if it's within your authority to do so. And a lot of the agencies were saying, we only have the authority to write at the infraction level. And that information, we kind of brought it up and actually had some really good conversations with Fish and Wildlife, and were able to get the ball rolling. A bunch of NGOs took over the charge from there and passed a legislation to make MPA it's called a wobblet, which means you can write a ticket both as an infraction and as a misdemeanor. And that opened it up, so some of our allied agencies that could only cite for infractions were able to help with that enforcement effort. So that was a good back and forth. Also, just having guidance from Fish and Wildlife on outreach materials. Make sure they're all the same colors. Make sure we're using the same language, because we have this network of all of these local groups that are creating maps and brochures and educational materials and signs and some great stuff, and we want to make sure it's consistent and we're all speaking the same language and making the same points. And so having that guidance from the statewide leadership team, from Ocean Protection Council, from Fish and Wildlife was really important. So it's just back and forth between all the on-the-ground actors and then all the managing agencies, and making sure that we're communicating and that everything's more effective. And then just one more example, sorry, I think is interesting, is we talked about technology already. There's all this great technology coming out. So we have these mini ROV technologies that people are excited to use, and for monitoring, for education and outreach, but it's new technology. So what are the impacts? So being that middle liaison between the excitement and the people that are on the ground that want to use technology, and some of the state and federal agencies that are like, okay, wait a second, let's talk this through and think about, are there any potential impacts? Are there ways to mitigate those impacts? Are there ways to train people on how to use this technology responsible? Are there any restrictions in any of these places? It just makes it so we're communicating, we're ahead of the game, and we don't have to be reactive. We can really be proactive. So I think it's an important relationship.
It is. Okay, last question for you, Kella. Over the last year, OPC partnered with Coastal Quest to administer our first ever small grants program for MPA outreach and education. The small grants program awarded $15,000 to each collaborative to create outreach materials that would improve compliance of MPA regulations and instill a sense of stewardship among the public. Many of the products created will be on display at your table this afternoon at the MPA fair, I guess in just a few minutes, really. What was the significance of the small grants program for the collaborative network, both on a regional and a statewide scale?
I can't really overstate this enough, and I think there's a lot of collaborative members in this room that will agree or watching that this was just, it was really empowering to the collaboratives to have this recognition by the state that their work and their input was valued, and that, let's leverage these resources, and by giving this amount, we're able to focus on small projects in each county that then could be shared and replicated and built upon and localized, and all of a sudden, just with one small push, you're able to have a much bigger impact across the network. So it was just really empowering for the collaboratives and able to leverage those resources, and it really felt like, yes, we're all in this together, and this is a team effort, and we're going to find our local resources to help the state because they're using their resources to help us. And it was a really, really cool experience. We have a huge amount of resources at the fair to share with you guys if you're interested. We have what each of the 14 collaboratives did, and there's some great ideas that came from that effort, And I think there's going to be a lot more moving forward too. We're just going to keep building and building and expanding, and it's exciting. So we really appreciate that. Thank you, OPC.
And thank you for helping kind of shepherd this critical social infrastructure that we need to make sure that our MPAs endure into and are successful into the future. So thanks, Kala. Our next panelist is Megan Van Pelt, and Megan is currently the Executive Director of the Resiliency Rancheria, a small tribe of Huron people. She's been working with and for North Coast tribes for 15 years, 10 of which included work on MPAs. Her MPA work has included advocating for protection of tribal rights and management of the ocean, sitting on the North Coast Regional Stakeholder Group to design the MPA network, which was super easy, right? Leading a baseline monitoring project focused on incorporating indigenous traditional knowledge, and now being the North Regional Tribal Representative on the MPA statewide leadership team. Welcome, Megan. What unique perspective can California tribes bring to MPA management?
Tribes in the North Coast, I'll speak to specifically, have creation stories of being there since time immemorial. So you have generations and generations and generations of knowledge being passed down. This really adaptive management, right? So adaptive management since time immemorial, you could say. So in that sort of body of knowledge, which we like to call indigenous traditional knowledge, a lot of academics call it traditional ecological knowledge. There's a lot of information in there about protocol and laws on how to take care of the ocean, how to respect it, sort of that interconnection between people and environment that provides the laws by which people live by, that continues today. Similar, you have those observations of place. Indigenous people of the North Coast are place-based people, so you have those observations, again, for generations. So it provides a lot of information, I think, for management that can be used, but it also, louder, but it also isn't easily integrated into the state sort of process, right? And so that's something that while tribes really advocated for continued use of the ocean and recognition of tribal rights, because that is an area in the law that's really never been settled. So tribes still continue to assert full rights to the ocean and use. I kind of lost my train of thought. So I think that just needs to continue to be protected. And so where I was going, so that information really can't be integrated in the state. So that's something that we've been really pushing back on. While that information should be sort of respected and brought in, it can't just be sort of applied from one particular area across the entire state, right? Because it is very place-based. It's very unique to that particular tribe or group of people or even family level. So in order to really bring that unique perspective in, it really takes sort of engagement at a government-to-government level. And to do that, you really have to help build the capacity of the tribe itself in order to be able to allow them to bring that knowledge forward as they want to do that themselves. I think also indigenous traditional knowledge can tell a lot about the baseline. So MPAs, we did this whole baseline project, and now looking at long-term monitoring, but what are you really evaluating from, right? So the baseline itself is not a healthy place. And so having that knowledge can really provide a deeper context to that baseline too. And then obviously on the North Coast, it's very unique that we have tribal take recognized in marine protected areas. So tribes have fought really hard for that space. While it's not a perfect solution, it at least acknowledges that there is a unique sort of right there for tribes in having tribal take. So I think encouraging tribes to continue to play a role in managing and informing what tribal take means is also really important to the state.
Thank you. So as a member of the MPA statewide leadership team, you represent tribal priorities and concerns for an entire region of the California coast, which includes ancestral territories of many different tribes. What's your approach to making sure that the input of multiple tribes is heard by decision makers?
Yes, so that's very difficult, I'm not gonna lie. So first and foremost, I represent the tribe that I work for, Resiliency Rancheria, who is acknowledged on the Redding Rock State Marine Protected Area. But as she said, so I sit for the northern region, and the way that they split up the tribal representation was for 4 regions, and so we have a primary and an alternate. And they just went out to solicit more tribal representatives. So hopefully soon we'll have some extra help, and that will be really great. But for me personally in my region, I really have over the years developed a network of colleagues across the tribes in our region, and so I really rely on them sort of sharing information, getting their feedback, and then providing that through the statewide leadership team. If things are particularly sort of elevated policy level, we can always work through the Northern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, which is a formal organization that brings together all the chairmen in the North Coast. And there's similar entities in the Central and Southern California as well. So I assume those representatives use those forums as well. And then obviously we always still have the consultation policies of the different state agencies under the Resources Agency. So if there's a particular project that that agency is working on and goes through the tribal consultation policy, then I sort of try to just sort of, again, put a little plug in my colleagues' ear that this is a particularly important thing because tribes are dealing with a lot of information all the time. Many staff wear multiple hats, and so I just try to kind of give a little like, okay, kind of pay attention to this in particular, so they can kind of take it from the bottom of the stack on their desk and put it on the top and pay a little bit closer attention. So,
thank you. So last question for you, Megan. The MPA network was established to protect our coast and ocean for the benefit of all Californians. What benefits do you hope MPAs will provide for future generations of tribal members?
Well, I just think that as like all Californians, you know, the importance of healthy ecosystems, a healthy ocean is so important to everybody. Increased access to species is critical. For tribes, you know, who rely on these species for food, but then also for culture, for ceremony, you know, these species are critical to cultural survival, right? So, so making sure that they're available, that they're still in the locations where people have traditional ownership rights to continue to gather. So when you hear about species moving 4 kilometers, for a tribe that has, you know, ownership rights in a particular place because of the family or village they're tied to, that's huge, right? They can't just go and move 4 kilometers north and access something. So I think that's particularly important. Also, I think this forum provides a unique space for tribes' voices to be heard. And so I think that's a value. Continuing to build the capacity of tribes is very important and a value that I think the MPAs have sort of provided a catalyst for a lot of really great things that came out of a lot of heartache on the North Coast, but I think it's turned into a lot of really great things. I continue to sort of push on the tribal take issue. Again, I don't think it's totally resolved, and so continuing to sort of use that again as a way to talk about the bigger conversation of tribal rights in the ocean, I think, is where I want that conversation to continue. And then again, ultimately, the goal of co-management. And again, I think MPAs is a little microcosm, a way that we can sort of look at something on a small scale and find ways to co-manage and how we can sort of use that across the landscape in bigger, more meaningful ways. So.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you to you and all of our tribal partners for your ongoing engagement with us, your patience, and your wisdom. We really appreciate it. Our last panelist today is Jennifer Savage. Jennifer is the California Policy Manager for the Surfrider Foundation, but she's joining us today as a representative of the Expert Assessment Group for the IUCN Green List. So the Green List program is an initiative to certify protected and conserved areas around the world that represent a global standard for best practices in conservation. California's MPA network has officially been accepted as a Green List program as a candidate site. So if accepted, the certification on the green list would raise the profile of our MPA network as a global model for ocean conservation. So thanks for being here today, Jennifer. What would be the significance of adding our MPA network to this program, and why is it important that California's MPAs are recognized at an international scale?
Well, first and foremost, having global recognition would really confirm the success of the Marine Protected Area Network. There's 3 different components of green list criteria. There's good governance, sound design and planning, and then effective management, all of which, if are done well, result in positive conservation outcomes. And so if accepted into the green list program, it would show that California's MPA network was well designed, has been effectively managed, came from a place of good governance, and is very likely to have and continue the good conservation outcomes that we already have. It's also worth noting that if accepted, it would be the first network of marine protected areas that would be on the green list. So it's a unique applicant in that way.
Exciting. The expert assessment group is comprised of multiple stakeholders from across the state. Why is it important that stakeholders be involved in this committee, and what have you learned from this experience?
So much. and just to take a step back, as we're talking about the MPA network and the successes around it, obviously increased biodiversity and more fish, bigger fish, and everything that we know and want to see come out of the Marine Protected Area Network, that's the goal. That's the original triumph. But I think no less important of a secondary triumph is the public process that we went through. Not everyone loved it. It wasn't always fun, but it was really incredible to get so many people into the same rooms time after time after time and have these important and hard discussions. I think that, as a community, as a state, as a country, hopefully as a globe someday, we have really learned that when you have big decisions that are going to affect people on an individual or community level, the more people that are affected by it that you can involve in the discussions leads to a better outcome and ultimately less controversy in the long run, even if it's incredibly painful along the way at times. Also, it's really, you learn a lot. I mean, you learn a lot hanging out and spending time with people who are operating in the world very differently than you and have different concerns. And you don't want to overlook things. And so while hopefully putting the MP network on the green list, I think comes with far less debate and concerns than establishing the network. We don't want to overlook anything. We want to make sure that all those voices, to the degree possible, that were represented in the creation of the MP network are also included in taking this really important next step. I mean, as Cal has said, it's part of our culture, it's part of who we are, and it adds to long-term stewardship. And if we're taking that to a global level, you want to have as many stakeholders in the conversation as possible.
Great. Are there opportunities for the public to be involved in the green list process?
Absolutely. Yes. So in evaluating the Marine Protected Area Network, there's a whole long list of global criteria that the IUCN has existing, and then what the group that I'm part of has to do is was to go through it step by step. Wordsmithing by committee is a fun time. And you want to make sure the criteria are relevant to what you're actually evaluating. And so, especially because this is the first network, we had to adapt the language so that it would make sense when we're going through the criteria to evaluate it. So the public has a chance to weigh in on that criteria to make sure that we didn't overlook anything, to make sure that the language that we ultimately came up with is accurate and reflects how the Marine Protected Area Network should be evaluated. And so currently we are in a comment period that is for California tribes. So that is continuing until July 17th. And then after that, there will be a 30-day public comment period. And that will be done, I believe, through the OPC website. There will be a link to that.
Yes.
Yes. So it should be a very easy to find and open opportunity.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. We have some time for questions from the audience. Okay, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I have one question. Looking at who participated in the MLPA and who's participating in the collaboratives, the biggest group I see went away are the fishermen, and a common explanation is they're gone fishing. It's very, very hard to get them. But, and I have seen some softening, and some surveys showing a softening of some of their hard feelings, but are we seeing progress in the panelists with the getting more support from the fishing industry is my question.
Yeah. So I don't know, Kala, do you want to start?
Sure.
Since it was
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, it's something that we've really been working on, and we're showing actually a pretty substantial increase in participation of fishermen into collaboratives. I think it started with them seeing that their voices will be listened to and heard and their ideas incorporated, and kind of building that success and building that trust too. It was going to take a little while, and now they're really being more and more active. And I think having other things like the collaborative fisheries research project, did I say that right? Sort of. Where they're involved in the monitoring and they're able to share their thoughts, I think has really helped. But we hope to keep increasing that as well, because they're a vital, very important stakeholder.
Thanks.
Thank you all for the interesting insights. And I guess my question is really maybe for Jennifer, but really anyone. So I've been working on marine protected areas and traveling the world and other areas, Europe, whatever, small islands, and I'm the biggest cheerleader for the California process, for the MLPA, both in terms of the scientific design, but also in terms of the stakeholder process that went into it. And in running around the world trying to cheerlead for our process, the biggest criticism that I hear from really everybody is, well, yeah, you guys had more money than anyone ever has to throw into this process. And your model is not exportable, because we could never do that, because we don't have millions and millions and millions of dollars. And that's not just small Pacific nations, that's, Europeans, France, Portugal, all that. So I wonder if, I never had a great answer to it, to be honest. And I wonder if anyone, you, Jennifer, or OPC, or Becky, just talked to some folks from Indonesia. How have you ever heard that pushback, and how can we make the California experience maybe be a little more exportable, and get away from that idea that we only could do this because we had more money than, honestly, the GDP of some nations went into this process. And I'm not criticizing it. I'm a cheerleader, and I want to be able to make this exportable.
Well, as somebody who's worked for nonprofit organizations for many years now, certainly the search for money is a part of my life, like day to day it feels like. And so I would just say I don't see why it's that hard to duplicate. I mean, we were very fortunate that we were able to participate in this public-private process, but not every single country could this work in, because different countries are in different places, have different capacities as far as governments and culture and society and all that. But the idea that there's just not money. I mean, there's a lot of money in the world. Like, there's so much money. It's more about like making those connections. Like, find the people with the money who care about the ocean, show them the California model, how well it worked, what a great result we had. Now it's going to, potentially be globally recognized. So that, I think that's a real encouragement to say, like, this is the road that you need to go down. Now, how that, I wasn't around for the formation of that private-public partnership and how that all works. I can't speak to the nuts and bolts, but I think that's a model that could be implemented in a lot of places, and there just has to be the will to do it. I don't know. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think really using what we've done here in California as a model, right? And maybe you can't export all the pieces, but you can export some of the pieces, right? The stakeholder engagement and getting people in a room and figuring out how we do that in a way that's genuine and easy for people to participate. And like Jen said, like finding the people who do care about the ocean and who do have deep pockets to support these efforts across the globe and other places.
And we've learned so much from going through this process. Like each region got more and more efficient to some
Yes.
degree,
Yeah.
and in each region, so there were lessons learned. So if we were to, give advice or suggestions on how to replicate this process, like so much has already been done. So I think a new process could be far more efficient or scaled in a different way to be appropriate.
Yeah, Callie, you wanted to?
Just real quick, just because I did in a way try to at least replicate the stakeholder engagement process and building the collaboratives. And there are ways to definitely do it. I mean, it's about bringing people together, really, and giving them a voice, I think is the most important part of this whole process. And there was times when, and some of you might be here for the original meeting and some collaboratives where we met in a garage or we met in someone's kitchen and trying to just figure out how to bring people together or just figure out how we were going to build this stewardship. And so that's what I think about when you talk to other countries and like, how do we replicate this? And it's, it's really, they have to replicate it in a way that makes sense to their culture and their community. And there's ways to do that, I think. I mean, I agree with Jen, there's money out there. I haven't found any of it. But if you can find it, there's other ways to bring people together. I
We'll
think that's the most
happily join
important.
you on your global.
Yeah. Those in your suitcase.
Thank you.
I have something to add. Our process was incredibly fast by all standards of reason. And we did have a lot of funding. I think I totally agree with what Jennifer and Cal and everybody has said. But it doesn't always have to be that fast, right? And with the grassroots, and some of you may or may not remember, I wasn't involved. But at the beginning, when the state started out with this, the department failed miserably to try to get this thing going, mainly because there wasn't a lot of base funding for us to really do this. And there was a lot of opposition, which I can understand. So I think coupled with what these guys are saying, with the grassroots, but it also really depends on having the support of the decision makers, of the policy makers, from the government piece, but that can come from exactly those grassroots pieces that these guys are talking about. So it can happen in a lot of ways.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. Other questions, Eric?
Yeah, my name's Eric Ponsley, and I've worked with many of the panel members and many of the people in the room on the planning phase from all four of the study regions. And you may recall, but I had many discussions with stakeholders about, wow, there's all this effort going into the planning of this, and what's going to happen when we get to implementation. And so I think this is actually a really unique moment to ponder that a bit. So I want to ask the panel members, how are we doing, do you think? And what's happened in the implementation process that meets your expectations of what was going to happen? And what's been different from what we thought was going to happen? Because there's a lot riding on how well we implement all this work.
That's a good question.
Can I start? Even though I'm not a panelist, I just want to say I think that question is really timely given the projects that our council is going to consider in just a few hours, and really highlighting the investment that the state has made and really our commitment to seeing these special places implemented and taken care of in the long term. So I just wanted to flag that as the state's ongoing commitment to implementation. And then I'll kick it off to you guys to respond.
Sure. I mean, speaking mostly from a North Coast perspective, and for those who don't know, the North Coast was the last region of California to go through the process, and I'm always very keen to say the only place where we ultimately ended up with a unified proposal, which meant that instead of having multiple proposals that had to be decided on by the Blue Ribbon Task Force and Fish and Game Commission, that the North Coast came up with one single plan that was eventually adopted, and it was very hard to get there. But I think because of that, and because of all the work that had been done by everybody else leading up, we were able to get to this place. But it was incredibly controversial. I mean, when it first started on the North Coast, it was, there were it was just bad. So But by the time we got through it and we got to this place where even if people weren't super happy, there was a lot less anger, people felt their voices were heard, a lot of concerns were taken into consideration. And what we see now is people are just like very matter of fact. You know, the people who were super opposed are by and large kind of like, oh yeah, like they're there, it's not a problem like I thought it might be. And there are, I'm sure, some dissenters, but I don't hear those voices too much, and I talk to a lot of people. And it's really opened the door for so much more science and data. And that's what I'm really seeing on the North Coast, is now that we have moved into this next phase, kind of like everything we hoped for is starting to manifest and leading toward hopefully the outcomes that we want.
Yeah, go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, I think things have sort of played out how I expected in a happy and sad way, I guess. So I guess my fear, maybe moving forward, is that as long-term monitoring kicks off, that sort of all those people at sort of the regional, local level are sort of going to get left behind a little bit. And that things are going to go very statewide because that's easier, and you want that consistency across the board. And so I just hope sort of that local perspective doesn't get lost in that and engagement, right? So, tribes, I talked about indigenous traditional knowledge, but tribes also collect a lot of science and we're very involved in some of the scientific baseline projects. And I just don't see that engagement happening anymore with the long-term monitoring. And I think it's just a very valuable thing, not only to build tribes capacity, but they're right there. It's, you can minimize costs. It's just kind of a win-win all around. And so I hope that doesn't get lost. I hope, I'll say it again, the tribal rights issue doesn't get lost. Now I hope the state doesn't think, okay, we dealt with that, now we're moving on. And so that's my hope, is that conversation continues and it only picks up speed and doesn't sort of taper off.
Yeah, just in response to that, OPC and the department and the commission are really committed to making sure not only tribal expertise, local expertise is incorporated, but also having ongoing conversations that we've already started having with you, Megan, and others about how do we do this in a way that is respectful and meaningful and can inform the goal, our collective goal of protecting the ocean into the future. So those conversations are, I think, in their infancy, and we again appreciate your patience with us as we try to figure out exactly how to do this together. But it is definitely a priority for us, and something that we will hopefully be bringing to the council at a future meeting.
I definitely want to make sure that we keep those local voices alive, and I think that's my biggest thing for implementation is, the energy has not waned, I guess, at the local level. It's building, and so I take that as success right there.
Maybe one last question.
Okay, if it's a quick one.
Well, there's so many hands up.
There'll be lots of time for questions later in the day.
Okay, how about you in the back?
Thank you. Just providing benefits to all people. This is a question that I ask myself all the time. What steps can I do? I'm only talking to you guys because you are like a room full of really passionate people. I ask myself often, what steps can I do with my work that can help provide or bring on board people who are disadvantaged? I'm talking about social inequities, racial inequities, financial inequities, because those too are stewards of our environment. So I'm trying to ask this question to myself and to all you people, like what steps that are meaningful that we've done that can also bring them on board.
That's a great question, and something that we really want to keep focusing on. Definitely because those are all the local voices, and making sure that we're developing materials that are in the languages that people are speaking. Make sure we're reaching out to communities that are inland, so they feel ownership of these marine resources, telling the story about the land-sea connection. Really, the social justice component is really important, and I think it's good to do at the state level, but it's so important to build up from the bottom too, so those voices have, you have a chance to speak your truth and be heard. So I think it's an important thing that we we need to keep thinking about every day and asking ourselves, are we doing it well enough? Are we bringing everybody into this conversation? So thanks for bringing it up.
Okay, Scott's giving me a dirty look. So everyone is going to be available and milling around at the MPA fair. So please, those of you who didn't get your questions answered, you can find people offline. Again, thank you to everyone. I think we have.
Why don't we take the panel first?
Yes, thank you, panelists. And we've just got a few closing remarks from both Becky and Deborah, and then we will move on to the fair downstairs. Thank you.
So, hello again, and it's more of information about, and these last few questions that were given to the panel is perfect segue into what I want to talk to you guys about now. And Deborah touched on it at the beginning of our meeting this morning about the 2022 evaluation of the the MLPA and the MPAs network. So what that means is we did do this regionally as we talked about, but what was realized in 2012 when the North Coast was the final one put in place, and at that time there were, every 5 years, there was an evaluation of each region. That is not sustainable on a number of fronts. Plus, biological processes don't react that quickly in 5 years. So it just didn't make sense to do this every 5 years. So at that point in time, it was decided that a formal review of the network and of the program would be every 10 years. So that is in 2022. So what's going to happen in 2022 and what we are working on right now, the three major organizations right now in the leadership team, is getting ready for that 2022 evaluation with the Fish and Game Commission. Remember, the commission, they are the decision makers about any kind of changes that may occur within the MPAs or the MPA network. So we're going to bring that evaluation to them. Within that is going to be a report out of all 4 focal areas. Remember, outreach education, monitoring and research, enforcement compliance, and then whatever policy and permitting we need to update them on and what has happened since. We've got 10 years to report out. Within that is going to be the science component of I talked about the action plan, and if we're all saying our prayers, the $17 million that will go towards the projects from the action plan are going to be one of the focal points of the science, but that's not all. It will also build upon the baseline monitoring, other monitoring that's been happening throughout the state by other entities and citizen scientists. It's going to wrap everything up, hopefully, and tell a story. What is that story going to be? We don't know yet. It's going to happen within the next 3 years. We're also working on a communications plan that will also incorporate the ability for the public, folks as yourself, to also have input on what goes into that evaluation, what they want to see in it, and how we're going to go forward with that. So really, we're working on it now. It's in another 3 years. It's scary to think it's only 3 years away. We have a lot of work to do, but that is the purpose of that evaluation. This is not a regulatory meeting. It's scheduled to be tentatively in December of 2022 for the Fish and Game Commission. We are planning on public outreach meetings, a variety of different communication processes that we're still formulating. Once we get that together, we will definitely let everybody know. It is not a regulatory meeting. That's going to be very important. It's no regulations are going to be adopted in the December meeting. Recommendations as a result of this process will be provided to the Fish and Game Commission. Perhaps, maybe, out of that process, there could be potentially changes, but we don't know that yet. So it'll be an informational meeting, not a regulatory meeting. That's a really important distinction. So keep watching for news from us about the next steps on 2022 and the things that will be coming up. And it'll be another very exciting meeting to go to. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Becky.
this is so exciting. 2022 is right around the corner. So I'm going to talk for about 1 minute about what California is doing on an international front as far as our MPAs, and then I will release you to go down and take a look at this MPA fair that we have set up. So in addition to the green list that you heard Jen Savage talk about, we have been working, and also as you heard Secretary Crowfoot talk about earlier today, we've really been thinking about how to elevate California's MPA network internationally. So we have been working very closely with the Secretariat of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, thinking about how we can do knowledge sharing with other countries and really continue that dialogue that's been started, exploring opportunities to continue to consider California's MPA network, how we manage our network, how other countries manage their MPAs, and what kind of cross-cultural, jurisdictional coordination we can have. We're also thinking about how to work more closely with the Mexican government. So there's some interest at the state level about expanding our coordination with Mexico, and so we're looking at where we can intersect. We have an ecological connectivity to Mexico. What does that mean for their MPA program and for our MPA program, and what does that look like in the future? And then we're also really thinking about, as Jen Cassell and Pete Raimondi mentioned in the science panel, how do MPAs intersect with the other stressors that are occurring in our ocean, particularly climate change, but some of the other issues as well. So we want to begin expanding our contemplation of MPAs to take it outside of just fishing in abundance and really start thinking about what other role can it play, even kind of by happenstance, and what does that look like in the future. So before I release you, I want to do a couple of thank yous. First, thank you for attending here today and for participating and for your passion and commitment and time that you have devoted to the MPA network and to California's biodiversity and environmental protection. It is deeply, deeply appreciated. And then I also want to thank what I lovingly call my MPA team. So Adrian David Fritz and Mike Escrow and Tova Handelman and Scott Chateau put this together. And I particularly want to highlight Scott's involvement. He is our Sea Grant Fellow this year. This was his idea to bring you all together. He initiated the idea, carried it out. So we have 100 people here. I mean, this is quite a success. So thank you, Scott. And just a reminder, go downstairs, check out the fair that we have going on. Don't forget your lunch ticket, because lunch is being provided.
We didn't hand out lunch tickets, so don't worry about
that. Oh, that's my God. Don't forget your lunch ticket. So you can forget your lunch ticket. I'll just cross that off my to-do list. And we will convene the council meeting at 1 o'clock, where we will be taking up $17 million in funding for our marine protected areas, a really important fisheries project, our strategic plan, our Prop 68 guidelines, so that we can spend more money, and then we'll wrap it up. So thank you all.